Welcome back to History 121 for our next lecture on the 1950s. I really want you to pay attention to this material today because this will really set up American foreign policy for the rest of the course and for, honestly, most of the rest of the 20th century. This lecture is about the beginning and establishment of the Cold War between the Americans and the Soviet Union, and honestly, this from 1947 to 1989, Americans are going to have foreign policy dominated by the Soviet Union and how to deal with communism on a global stage. What's the root of the problem with communism? At the end of the Second World War, we have a map here on the right-hand side of the screen. All the nations in red, you see the USSR on the far right, all the nations in red between the USSR and the blue nations are communist-controlled nation states at the end of World War II. Everything in blue are theoretically democratically aligned or democratically elected governments. The yellow countries are nations that either are not involved at the end of the Second World War or they are strange bit players in this global stage. And we'll kind of deal with them, but we're most concerned with the red nations and the blue nations. At the end of the Second World War, the Soviet Union is going to demand a buffer zone in Eastern Europe. It's going to prevent any future invasions, especially invasions from America or its democratically elected allies. It's also going to demand territories as reparations for what Germany did during the war, which is a very 19th century way of dealing with the question with winning a war. You usually demand penalties of the people who lose. But essentially what we also see with these nations in red is this is basically where Russian troops ended their Western advance as they at the end of the Second World War. Basically, the areas in red were under Soviet control at the end of World War II, and we have a divided Germany, and we have questions of what are they going to do? Well, the Soviets are going to claim that Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, these people are going to willingly, freely choose to have a communist government. In essence, the Soviets are going to set up puppet governments in these nations, and these, what will be called Eastern Bloc nations, are going to be a protective buffer zone for the Soviet Union. The Allied aims for Europe after the war is they want to restore democratically controlled, democratically elected forms of government to those nations that they liberated. This will include East Germany. They want to really pressure those countries that may not be fully democratic to have more democratic control, democratic means to deal with these governments. Honestly, what we see is there had been really no trust between the Soviet Union and the outside world prior to World War II. World War II, with the invasion of Russia by the Germans breaking a treaty that they had with the Russians become allied with America, Great Britain, and France out of necessity. Once Hitler is defeated, essentially we go back to communist nations distrusting democratic nations and vice versa. This is going to come to a head in Germany over the fate of the German nation. Essentially, the best summation of this all, Winston Churchill will give a speech at a Missouri college in 1946 in which he declares An iron curtain has descended across Europe, dividing Europe between free and communist states. This speech coins the term the Iron Curtain, and that's really how we're going to view Eastern Europe and Western Europe and their division through the end of the 1980s. Essentially, American foreign policy is going to be dominated by the question of how do we deal with communism and communist states. The first iteration of this policy is going to be called the Truman Doctrine. Essentially, Harry Truman and the State Department are going to concoct a foreign policy that the U.S. will support any nation that is, quote, resisting subjugation by armed minorities or outside forces, end quote. What this means is if you are Greece or Turkey or any Eastern European nation or nation that seeks assistance because honestly, communist forces are trying to assault your government, they're trying to have a communist revolution in your country, or if something can be construed as being communist, the United States is going to step in and help those nations because communism is bad and democratically elected governments are better in the eyes of the American people and honestly most nations. So this is essentially going to be the roots of containment, and we'll talk about containment in a bit. This is also going to be assisted in its development by George Kennan's long telegram. Kennan worked as a diplomat at the American Embassy in Moscow. He spent several years, including the latter years of World War II, studying Soviet psyche and how the communist government in the Soviet Union viewed itself as to how it viewed the outside world. And Kennan's long telegram is essentially going to be the basis for American foreign policy from here forward. Communists see themselves as being in constant conflict with capitalistic democratic states, no matter where they are. Under the Soviet interpretation of communism, it is their goal to make every nation on the face of the earth communist. Until that happens, the communist revolution has not ended, and so they are at war with every state that is not communist. Kennan is going to note that seemingly every Marxist or person who espouses Marxist or communist ideology outside of the Soviet Union is being manipulated by the Soviets. We're also going to see out of the so in essence what that means is if there are people in the United States saying, well, we need to have a change in government, we need to bring in more socialist ideals into our government, that we need to bring more, we need to change aspects of our nation, that these people are under communist influence. That's going to be important when we talk about race relations in this country. Keep that in the back of your mind. We're also going to see an ideology that the Soviet Union feels like it is being attacked on all sides and therefore must counterattack or attack first in order to defend itself. Anybody who is not for us is against us, is how we view the communists and their view of the outside world. And Kennan lays out that the best way to deal with this is to develop public education programs both in the United States and broadcast around the world through films, radio, and any model that we can give, especially European nations, to portray that the American way of life is the best way of life in the world, that we're going to project an image of the U.S. as the exemplar of lifestyles. The exemplary way to live is American capitalism, and American democracy combined. One way that this is going to be implemented is the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan is developed by Secretary of State George C. Marshall in the wake of the Second World War. It's a plan to help promote the recovery of Europe. Western Europe has been decimated by war. You really would be hard pressed to find an area or a major city in Europe that has not been bombed into obliteration, that has not seen a massive decrease in its population. Europe can't produce food for itself. Europe has no manufacturing at this time. And so Europe is essentially a vacuum. And what America plans to do under the Marshall Plan is to step in and rebuild Western Europe in the American image. We're going to give Western European nations, England, France, West Germany, Italy, any nation that wants it, $13 billion total in aid. We're going to help revitalize European industries. We're going to help rebuild agriculture. We're going to help rebuild these cities so that Europe can live again. I mean, you can't find any. I know it's been 70 years since the end of the war, but we're talking in a relatively short period of time. 4 years for the destruction of the Second World War to really honestly disappear. That's a very quick period of time to recover and rebuild Europe. And it's all done with American money and American values because, of course, if European nations are destroyed, they need to buy these goods from someplace. So you remember I talked about the building boom in the last lecture and the new industrial boom in America following the war. Part of that industrial boom is rebuilding Europe. It is making materials to sell to Europe because Europe can't fend for itself at this point. We're also going to offer these loans and these programs to Eastern Bloc nations, basically with the understanding that they're going to refuse them. The Soviet Union will not accept any outside aid to help repair itself from the war damages, from the 10 million people that died at Hitler's hands just within the confines of the Soviet Union. Poland, East Germany, all of these countries that I named earlier as being in the Eastern Bloc, they're all going to decline American assistance essentially because, as I said, they're Soviet puppets. And the Soviet Union won't allow aid from democratic capitalistic nations. All right, here is where things are going to really get tense in the post-war world. As I mentioned, Germany is going to be divided in half. There is East Germany and West Germany. Essentially, it's divided into four, but America is going to set the policy overall for Western Germany. And following the war, when we end occupation, this is how the country of East Germany and the country of West Germany are going to be created. The areas in pink are British-dominated zones. Areas in blue are French. But mainly, the largest section is the yellow American-controlled zone. And this division between the four powers, essentially, the four allied nations divide up Germany as a means to re-educate and rebuild it following the war. This is also going to happen in Berlin. Berlin, which is in red in the middle of or deep in Soviet-controlled East Germany, is going to be divided amongst the four allies as well. East Berlin is going to be the Soviet zone, and then the British, the American, and the French will help control and rule West Berlin in this time period. And what's going to happen is essentially the Soviets under Stalin are upset that they don't have the entirety of Germany to punish. And believe me, they want to punish Germany for everything that's gone on in the war, but they're especially mad that they don't control the entirety of Berlin. They feel that since it's in their area of their zone of control, it should have been it should have been left entirely to them. And so what they're going to do is they're going to blockade the British, American, and French allies from getting goods into Berlin as a means to try and force them out of Berlin with the hope that maybe they'll abandon Germany altogether. Out of this, we're going to see the rise of the Berlin airlift. There are 2 million civilians in Berlin that need food, fuel, clothing, and all of the various goods necessary to live a life. When the Soviets essentially blockade Western access to Berlin, what they do is they leave open 3 air corridors, and they say there's no way that anybody could actually fly enough supplies in to keep Berlin, especially in Western Berlin, supplied. So we're going to keep these 3 air lanes open. We'll let them fly in their troops and their diplomats and whoever is, but there's no way that they're going to be able to fly in supplies. And essentially, the United States is going to say, hey, hold my beer. We're going to organize the Berlin airlift, and 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for the next almost a year, airplanes are going to fly in this very narrow corridor, air corridor, and bring in every possible means of life to keep Western Berlin alive, supplied, and in America and its allies' hands. What that means is they're going to fly in 1,500 tons of food and 3,500 tons of coal or fuel per day, 7 days a week, in order to keep everything going. And it's going to be tight. There's going to be rationing. Ultimately, the Soviets will give up and the Berlin airlift will be successful. They'll no longer need to fly in supplies. The Soviets will give up in the face of this. But this is seen as the first big victory against communism and communism's goal to control Europe. One of the little things that happens during the Berlin airlift are the candy bombers. Essentially, the American pilots who flew these airplanes in and day out, as you can see, they're going to fly over these massive crowds of people who are watching the planes coming in, bringing in all the necessaries of life. Amongst them are kids. And these kids are the survivors of war. In some cases, they're orphans. They're looking for any sign of hope. And American pilots will start taking baggies full of chocolate bars and hard candies and lollipops, and they're going to start throwing them out of the windows of their airplanes as they fly over the crowds as a means of getting some kind of treat or some kind of enjoyment or some kind of gift to these children to keep their hope alive. Ultimately, the candy bombers, what started out as a few pilots doing their own thing, will turn into Operation Little Vittles. And it will be a part of the everyday life of these kids, is to try and catch candy falling from the skies. It sounds like the world's most trite, trumped up Hollywood movie. But it's true. It actually happened. It was one of the ways that kept these kids and their hopes alive in the face of this constant communist menace around them, to having their way of life threatened. As I said, ultimately American foreign policy is going to end up with containment. All major U.S. foreign policy is going to spend the next 40-odd years attempting to contain communism wherever it is. In other words, if you already have a communist state, if you have China, if you have Poland, the Soviet Union, those states have chosen communism. We're not officially going to intervene and try and overthrow that communism. And there's whole classes you can take on that, or books you can read on that if you wish. But we're going to try and prevent communism from spreading out into the rest of the world. To do this, we're going to create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. These essentially are going to be America's allies from the Second World War at first. Um, England, France, any nation that chooses, that is not communist, that chooses to pledge to come to the other nation's assistance should there be an attack by the Soviet Union. We're also going to see the National Security Council issue Bulletin 68. This is going to promote the research and development of nuclear weapons as an anti-Soviet tool. We're going to quadruple military spending in the name of containing communism. And we're going to spread communism, pardon me, that Freudian slip. We're going to spread propaganda about communism throughout American culture and throughout the Western world that looks to American culture in order to fight the spread of communism. We're going to have cartoons. We're going to have any TV shows, news stories, books are going to be printed talking about how American democracy is the best way of life, and that communism is the worst possible way of life. And honestly, this is going to last for the next 40 years. The American government, if we get wind of a movie, we're gonna spend money to help promote a movie or help make movies that make communists look bad. We're gonna help make movies that talk about how great America is. This is the first Red Dawn that comes out in the 80s with Patrick Swayze and all the Brat Pack actors that are showing how American high school kids can stand up and contain communism to the areas that it's invaded, and we're going to fight this great war if it ever happens. That's American foreign policy through 1989 when communism ends, and in Western Europe in 1991 when the Soviet Union ceases to exist. Everything we do is based on trying to defeat communism internationally. It's going to dominate our foreign policy. It's going to dominate our way of life. And that first great test of containment is going to be the Korean War. Korea, after the Second World War, had been divided along the 38th parallel. We gave the communists, we gave Russia essentially the north, we established a democratic government in the south. North Korea in 1950 will invade South Korea in order to attempt to unify the Korean peninsula. They'll be supported by the Soviet Union with the latest in jet technology, rocket technology, uniforms, guns, etc. They just won't actually have any Soviet Russians initially fighting on that front. America will intervene, and it's bad. The Korean War, the initial surge by the North Koreans, almost captures Seoul. It almost succeeds in taking over the Korean peninsula. America has some forces stationed there anyway. They will be pushed back incredibly quickly. This is essentially a surprise attack. No one really knows that this is coming. And America will very quickly intervene with more troops, and they'll actually push the North Koreans back almost to the Chinese border. There will be debate about using the atomic bomb again. MacArthur is all for it. He wants to use the atomic bomb on North Korean positions. Hell, MacArthur wants to use the atomic bomb and preemptively bomb China to prevent them from interacting or stepping in, and Truman denies the request. Truman has already ordered the use of 2 atomic weapons at the end of World War II on Japan. He will not use atomic weapons again. Ultimately, the Chinese will mount a massive counterattack. Millions of Chinese soldiers will pour over the China-North Korea border, and they will push America and South Korea all the way back, essentially to the 38th parallel. What we're going to have is we're going to have a stalemate develop at the 38th parallel, and that's where active combat will cease after a 3-year stalemate. That, honestly, if you're watching the news right now, this is 2018 with Kim Jong-un's outreach last week, and I don't know what's going to come of it, but this is actually the closest we've come to talking about a peaceful resolution and finality to the Korean War that we've had since 1951. This is, or 52. I don't know what's going to come of it. I'm not a foreign policy analyst. I'm a historian. I can say that we've come close to this point before, and we've also come very close to having war reignite on the Korean Peninsula. Remember, just because American forces aren't involved in an active shooting war at the demilitarized zone doesn't mean that there haven't been Koreans that have died in the last 60 years. They are still dying on a daily basis along the DMZ as South Koreans and North Koreans shoot at each other, even though we're under a stalemate, a ceasefire. So I don't know. By the time I give this class again in the fall, we could be talking about an entirely different world on the Korean Peninsula. But in essence, to get back to the lecture, it's a stalemate. Things will stabilize at the 38th parallel, which is where they are now, and the militaries of both sides will spend the next 60 years staring through tangles of barbed wire and no man's land, back and forth at each other, not sure if war will ever reignite on the Korean Peninsula again. That's American foreign policy. What we need to talk about next time is how American domestic policy it deals with the Cold War and the rise of the new Red Scare at home. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'll talk to you guys soon.